So we're finishing the first part of the book of Matthew. We're finishing what is essentially the story of Joseph. And we've covered that Joseph was a descendant of King David. But unlike too many other descendants of King David, from what we've covered, we've seen that Joseph was a man after God's heart, just like King David was. We've covered that Joseph went through something really heartbreaking. He finds out the woman he was meant to marry turns out to be pregnant with somebody else's child. But thankfully he learns that that somebody else was God. And the pregnancy that initially broke his heart ends up revealing that he and his soon-to-be wife, that he and his wife had been chosen by God to take care of God's one and only son, the Messiah. Joseph's response to Mary's pregnancy was to divorce her quietly so that she wouldn't be exposed to public disgrace. It was Joseph's heart that Mary not experience disgrace, because Joseph had a heart that desired grace, which was an action that revealed the kind of man Joseph was. It was an action that revealed Joseph was a man after God's heart, just like King David was. A man after God's heart is a man who follows the desires of God's heart, refusing to be led by the deceptive nature of their own heart. That was the kind of man Joseph was. But unfortunately, too many other descendants of King David were not men after God's heart like David was, like Joseph was. Too many descendants of King David were misled by the deceptive natures of their heart. And perhaps one of the most tragic, if not the most tragic examples of this was King Ahaz. When King Ahaz was going through one of the most difficult times in his life, when King Ahaz was going through a time of trouble, he put his trust in the Assyrian Empire instead of putting his trust in the power of God. He put his trust in the power of the Assyrian Empire. And the amazing Bible scholar J. Alec Meyer, he explains that Ahaz's decision led to a process where the Assyrian Empire and later the Babylonian Empire would overpower and overcome God's kingdom. There were good kings like King Hezekiah who wanted to follow God and wanted to have hearts that resembled God's heart. But there were too many kings like King Ahaz who fell in love with false gods. They fell in love with false gods and they really fell from grace. The way I see it, following the examples of kings who were not men after God's heart, God's people fell for the deceptive nature of their own heart, followed the sinful desires of their heart. And my own life experience has taught me that following the sinful desires of your heart will dull your senses. Living in sin will suck the life out of you. By turning to the sinful pleasures of your heart, you're turning away from God. You're turning away from the pleasures found and following the desires of God's heart. So when you follow sin, you're turning away from God, so that the power of God is not with you, so that you are vulnerable to the powers of this world. So God's people were vulnerable to the powers of this world, because they turned away from the power and presence of God. And this led to Jerusalem being seized by the Babylonians. And in the year 586 BC, the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and the throne of David disappeared from the earth. Descendants of King David were no longer kings. God's people were overpowered by the hand of the Babylonians, and the power of the Babylonians took God's people into exile. And this was the price God's people paid for following the sinful desires of their heart.